Okay, so I want to officially welcome you to First Church in Belmont's program on Is the Ukrainian War an Ethnic Conflict? And we are really interested in this discussion for a number of reasons. I will say that my background includes being the co-chair of First Parish in Concord's Partner Congregation Committee, just as First Church has a partner church committee. And I came to think about this subject because I know that while our partners are in Romania, in Transylvania, they are ethnic Hungarians and they speak Hungarian. And it seemed to me that a lot of the issues that our partners have with affiliation or affinity toward Hungary, even though they are living in Transylvania and Romania, are mirrored in this Ukrainian war. And so I thought this would be a really interesting discussion while we're all very concerned about the war in Ukraine and the devastation. This program is really about a deeper view of, is it an ethnic conflict? And what does that mean? What does that actually mean? So we're going to be grappling with that subject tonight. And so I think I've told you everything that you need to know about Mute and about Zoom. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn this program over to our very own First Church member, David Deese. And as many of you know, David and Jerry are both at Boston College in the political science department. And we are really grateful to both of them actually for coming tonight to share their expertise and knowledge about this subject. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Lillian. Tonight, we're very grateful to have Doug Kobayashi speak after Jerry. Doug has done long government service, mainly at the municipal level in different countries, including the Ukraine. And so we're looking forward to his thoughts after Jerry. I was surprised and pleased when we asked Jerry if he would be able to speak tonight, and he said yes. The reason I'm surprised and pleased is, first, I always send my advisees and my students to do their introductory courses in comparative politics with Jerry, especially his courses on the modern state and state building, his advanced courses on Russia, Eastern Europe, because he's a great teacher. I've known that for decades. He's funny and he knows his stuff. And most recently, he's actually taken to writing novels with a great deal of research. So Jerry, his research focuses on the modern state, post-communist transitions, and comparative political economy. His current project is on comparative policing and pre-modern politics. And I know over the years he's lived in Russia and the region to do research, also with his wife, who has written various books on traveling to the region. And most recently, he's author of a book that I think he might have held up earlier, The Tsarina's Lost Treasure. Now that was in 2020. And now actually more recently and forthcoming is his book called The Last Stand of Ravenclaw, When Russia Went to War in America. So I'm going to be looking for that one. His earlier work, and I'll just mention a couple of books, is Reconstructing the State, Personal Networks and Elite Identity in Soviet Russia. Later, he wrote Shaping the Economic Space of Russia. And then a terrific book that I read in great detail, Capital Coercion in Post-Communist States. Yeah, and so we're really grateful to Jerry because he's willing to serve as our chair in our not always harmonious department. But we're particularly grateful for his thoughts and his commitment to speaking to us tonight. So thank you, Jerry.
Do I have to unmute my, okay. Thank you, David. That was so nice. You made me sound nice. uh, and thank you all too for inviting me. And I hope that you enjoy the talk. Okay, so Van, please leave. It just started. All right, sorry. One of my kids just came home. It's these days, of course. So my expertise is in Russia. I was actually trained when there was still a Soviet Union, but Russia has become my focus since the since my very early days as a scholar and professor. So these days I get asked to speak about this conflict quite a bit, and I'll be honest with you, well, as soon as I start talking, I seem to upset people rather than see their faces go, oh, so that's what's happening. Instead, they often get angry at me because I'm reluctant to push the Putin is doing it all narrative, which dominates so much of the discussion about it, as well as the proposed solutions or why there can't be a solution. So indeed, Putin is a key player in what is happening. Without Putin, I think it would be unlikely that we'd be seeing this war. But nonetheless, what brought us to this point is more complicated than just simply the personality of Putin. The second intro remark is this is the first session that I've been invited to speak at, or that I've just seen the title of. On a daily basis, I get bombarded with Zooms from colleagues, and because everyone around the country and the world is having conversations about what's happening. This is the first one that I've ever seen that phrased their talk as, I think it's the war in Ukraine, is it an ethnic conflict? And whether you knew it or not, that's actually a rather provocative title. It's a provocative title because it is rejecting the aggressive Putin Russian war narrative that I just mentioned. So this could be the one place where what I has to say won't be met with the urge to throw tomatoes. And to go ahead and do it, you'll just be messing up your own laptops if you do. Okay, so I broke it down into a few 4 sections. 2 are a bit longer. Two I can even cut out and save for questions if it gets to be a bit much. But the first one, it's an introduction to the question about ethnic conflict in this part of the world. It would be something that I do in class. It's informed by history and social science, but I won't give you the academic-y version of it. And you can handle either the general audience or the academic-y version of it without a problem. So I know that too. So just by way of background, this part of the world, Eastern Europe has, in the modern period, if that's defined by the onset of it as the 19th century, has been the source of multiple violent, bloody conflicts, and almost always fueled by ethno-nationalism. In the 19th century, it's the time in history where peoples are becoming aware of themselves as nations, and they find themselves as members in empires that they don't want to be in. So that's true up and down Eastern Europe. There's the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman, that dominate the peoples of this region, and there has been conflict beginning in the early 1800s. Maybe the 1830 Polish Revolution is the first volley in what was a century plus of a very violent politics that culminates, of course, in the World War II period and the atrocities from that. The many different, the Holocaust, of course, takes center stage, but there are many ethnic cleansings in the period from the 1930s to the 40s. So the communist regimes come to power in the wake of World War II. In Russia, they've been there since World War I. And there's a period of decades in which ethnic conflict is generally subdued. It's put to rest. The communist regimes like to boast that they solved the nationality problem in Eastern Europe. Of course, then communism collapsed and nationalism was a driving factor in that collapse. And we saw violence as soon as it did collapse. But they did, you could give them credit for at least managing ethnic conflict with solutions like ethno-federalism or the deliberate affirmative action programs to promote people into the elite of a communist state, of a communist regime. So they did have strategies that I think did effectively manage ethnic conflict, but by no means did they solve the nationality problem. At the point at which, now it's 1989 to 1991, when communism runs its course and it collapses largely through its internal problems, just simply can't be managed any longer effectively. And with the rise to power in the Soviet Union of a leader that is looking for non-coercive solutions, that's Gorbachev. What happens is that Eastern Europe, the communist regimes fall in Eastern Europe, and shortly thereafter in the Soviet Union breaks up into its 15 constituent national republics. That's like our 50 states, except they're organized along ethno-national lines. Ukraine being one of them too. Okay, so at that point, so that's about the time that I was finishing my PhD and coming into academia and in the job market. And in my first teaching positions. And I remember very clearly the widespread pessimism, the widespread fears of the revival of bloody ethnic war across the communist, what was the communist world, up and down Eastern Europe and across the Soviet Union. The most common articulated scenario of what comes next was this idea that that into this void will come a revival of a neo-fascism, of angry nationalisms, of great resentment. And up and down the region, up and down Eastern Europe, from the Baltic down to the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, and across the vast Soviet Union, what scholars readily recognize as the preconditions for ethnic conflict existed everywhere. Those would be disputes over territorial borders. This is not the right border for our nation, for our people. And a second one related to that is ethnic minorities. Part of our nation now doesn't live with us. They live across the border in another nation in which they are now a minority, and they, depending on the government, depending on the history of the relations, perhaps are not being treated so well. A third issue is a competition over valued resources. That could be things like an electricity grid, a hydroelectric dam. It could be resources like the Soviet Union, Russia. In the Soviet Union, they built their big aerospace facility in Kazakhstan because they used to like to land on flat ground rather than in the ocean like we did. Their biggest naval base is sitting in Ukraine now, in Crimea. So a competition over valued resources that can be industrial, can be a commodity, or it can be a natural resource, rivers, for example. And the fourth reason that seems to incite ethnic conflict it's a vast scholarship that does Africa, does Asia, does Europe a bit too, does Europe much more so since the late 20th century. The last reason is living memories of violence. People who remember when somebody from the other group came over the hill and burned down their farm and killed their grandmother, etc. And that existed all across this space. And that was why there was such pessimism about what will come next. What happened, Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, Yugoslavia, of course, did implode in this bloody fashion. But what you saw happening in Bosnia, if you remember from more than 20 years ago, and in that part of the world, that was expected all across the space. And so it did happen there. And it did happen in a couple of places, a couple of pockets in the southern part of what had been the Soviet Union, in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. But for the most part, this ethno-doomsday scenario did not come to be. And so then the question is, why were the scholars wrong? So Dave's with, like me, in political science, and we we chase events, and each big event seems to show up what was a prevailing conventional wisdom, And so there's different explanations for why there was violence in some places, but not in other places. I'll give you what I think explains it best, because it feeds into how we get to where Russia and Ukraine is today. All right. In the northern part of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary especially, there's no nation I don't know about the world, but at least in Europe, that has legitimate grievances about its territorial borders than Hungary does. Hungary was like twice the size of what it is today before World War I. And the Hungarian minorities live in Ukraine, they live in Romania, they live in Slovakia as well. But the North was very peaceful. And the reason it's cynical, but I think honestly, the reason why the North didn't replicate what was happening in the South is because the North had already done it. From the 30s to the 40s, through the ethnic cleansings, through the Holocaust, and through the war, Northeastern Europe has been thoroughly ethnically cleansed. And those states today are among the most ethnically homogeneous states in the world. Poland, Czech, that you're talking close to 93, 94% ethnic homogeneity. And so they had already experienced the bloodshed in a way in which Southeastern Europe, where Yugoslavia, where it was still a patchwork of peoples, where that process hadn't been imposed upon them either spontaneously from below or imposed on them by governments from above, like it happened in the North. But another factor helps to explain why there's war in Yugoslavia, why there's war between, why there's war in the Caucasus, but why there's not war between Russia and Ukraine. And my suggested explanation is that the ethnic group that had been the dominant group in the old communist system, if they did not have serious grievances with the institutions of the old regime, with how communism worked and what communism did to them, then they were actually pretty good with, we can live with these borders. We can live with having 20 million Russians living as minorities across the outside of our realm now. That would be the case of Russia and Ukraine. That's where old communist bosses came to power in the early years of the post-communist period. Yeltsin, Kravchuk in Ukraine. They were used to making elite decisions behind closed doors. They were fearful of mobilizing at a popular level ethno-national sentiment for political ends. They were in power, so they didn't need to mobilize power from below. The same between Czech and Slovakia. Czechs did well in Czechoslovakia. They had no grievances with the breakup. In fact, they were glad for the breakup because they saw the Slovaks as being a drag on their economy. So it was actually not very contentious. I mean, there were negotiations, there was bargaining, but the resolution of the border between Russia and Ukraine, the issues like Ukraine will transfer nuclear weapons to Russia, issues like that were not politicized, and for the first decade, they were not a source of conflict. In Yugoslavia, Serbia was always very resentful of what their place was in Yugoslavia, resentful that they had to give up territory, resentful that they had to share with these other minorities. And Slobodan Milosevic politicized that at a mass level and turned that, and once he did it, there was a spiral effect, and it very quickly became a bloody war. But that's where we were, at least at that point. But I think it's an important point to make note of, to understand where we get to. All right. So the next thing, I'll talk a little bit about Ukraine, post-communist Ukraine. Dave, could you give me a time?
I think Lillian's, we're coming up on 8, so 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll do the Ukraine thing in the conclusion, which is quick, and I'll cut out the Russian thing, which will come up in the questions, no doubt. Okay.
Great.
All right. When Ukraine becomes independent, there's a couple of things there's great expectations, at least amongst many Ukrainians, that they will finally have their moment, that they're a big country, they have a great industrial base, they have a well-educated population, they have this highly productive agricultural sector, and that now that they're free of this Russian-dominated Soviet Union, that they were ready to rise up and take their place. And nothing remotely close to that happened. And Russia was not the reason why it didn't happen. For up until the mid 2000s, post-communist Ukraine had a very difficult time getting its act together in terms of settling on a new political system. And instead, there was constant elite conflict and a disregard for rules, a disregard for the rules of institutions that they're constantly changing depending on who was in power. And also, it's an example of one of these cases where the elite, the politically connected elite, and some of whom are holdovers from the old regime, were able to get their hands on and take ownership of the most valuable pieces of the economy. And today, Ukraine today, and again, it's not because of Russia. It is, I think it's the second poorest country in Europe by per capita income. Only Moldova beats it. Moldova is down around $3,500 to $3,800 per year dollars. And Ukraine is only sitting at about $4,200 a year per capita income. And Russia is sitting at Russia was as high as like 15, but now it's dropped to 12 because of sanctions. The one thing I'll say about Ukraine is this will get us to where others can talk to, is in the post-communist, all the newly independent post-communist states had to undergo a political transition for a new regime. Hopefully you can get democracy, but consolidate something, you know. Hopefully you can make a transition towards a market-based economy, and all of them prefer a kind of social market-based economy. But that's another challenge from the old communist command economy. But the third thing is nation building. You have to build a new nation, or a nation that fits your newly independent state. And in this regard, I think Ukraine is a bit challenged. I don't think it's unfair to say, I think by the time this war is over, it might no longer be true. But at least up until the war, it's not unfair to call Ukraine a divided nation. That there's a vision of Ukraine that comes out of the West, that as part of the vision of part of its vision of Ukraine is reflexively hostile towards Russia, and which is hostile towards communism and communist institutions. As we enter the post-communist period, these actors are calling for a purging of the nation of these influences, which are making the nation weak, which are a source of bringing us down, type of thing. Towards the East, you know, and they're distinguished by characteristics like language and religion. And in the East, there's peoples who Russia's their first language, their Orthodox Church. They're just closer to Russian culture, etc. All right, so that divide is one of the reasons is the main reason why Ukraine didn't end up like Belarus and Russia, because Ukraine was on the path towards incremental consolidation of authoritarianism. And it's in 2004, the Orange Revolution is able to successfully overturn a rigged election that you know, it adds to the ongoing political instability of Ukraine, but at the same time too, it saved them from being like Putin and Lukashenko. All right, and then that phenomenon of politicians. So this is the first time politicians who very much reflect the outlook, the Western outlook of Ukraine, are now in power or near power. Up to this time, it was it was former communist actors that were in charge, who weren't interested in politicizing nationality politics. All right. In 2010, there's an election that European observers declare is free and fair, and it brought to power the candidate from the East. That's Yanukovych, he's a pretty he's a pretty surly guy with a criminal record as a teenager. Made his way into, he's a corrupt former communist apparatchik. All right. But he did come to power in a free and fair election. He did that is true. And of course, then a few years later is what everyone knows, the Maidan Revolution. So the Maidan Revolution forced Yanukovych out of power when Yanukovych was forced to have to make a choice whether Ukraine's future lies with Russia in the Eurasian economic bloc in the East or with the EU in the West. And Yanukovych wanted to have it both ways. He begged EU leaders to have it both ways. And the EU was very tough on Yanukovych and set a series of very high hurdles to get over if you want to be in the EU. A very strict austerity program and the cleaning up all the corruption. Meanwhile, Putin just took out his bank book and just wrote him a check that it was hard to say no to. And Yanukovych said yes to it. That set off the Maidan Revolution. The Maidan Revolution had the effect. Okay, so here's where I'm wrapping up the beginning with this, and then I'll move quickly to just a couple of points in the wrap up. What the Maidan Revolution did was it empowered for the first time political actors in Ukraine who embraced a Western influenced vision of the nation. Post-Maidan, the first acts that were taken was to dismantle, disenfranchise the political party that had won the election and to disenfranchise the Russian-speaking voters in the East. It begins to impose cultural policies that would be a kind of Ukrainianization, some language policies, etc. They're very open about wanting to be in the West and wanting to be in NATO. That's when Putin grabs Crimea, where the naval base is. And where the conflicts in the East, in Donbass and Lugansk begin. So that's happening then. And I would say that that's the point at which Ukraine has actors in power who are resentful about the institutions of the old regime. And they want to eradicate all vestiges of that, culturally, socially, and politically. All right. All right, I'll say this quick, and then get to a quick wrap up. Russia goes through the post-communist period, at least the first 10 to 15 years, as a status quo power in this region. Status quo with what they see is the new post-Cold War Europe, which comes out of negotiations between the elder President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, negotiations over reunification of Germany, and they're willing to give back sovereignty to Eastern Europe, and they're going to live with that, and to their thinking that as part of this settlement, there is not going to be an eastward expansion of the Western military alliance, the NATO. All right. So for the first 10 years up to the early 2000s, Russia's very much status quo with the borders of the breakdown, with not making a fuss over an ethnic minority. And it was an issue in Russian politics. It was a big issue in Russian politics in the early mid-90s, that that we have to extend our borders to take in our ethnic minorities who are now vulnerable. And in the aftermath of the collapse of communism, the people in Crimea organized their own referendum. They wanted to go back to Russia. Yeltsin would have nothing to do with it. He goes, nope, we're going to live with these borders. Russia was not making an issue out of border disputes or ethnic minorities for the first decade. It doesn't account, and then Putin takes power in the winter of 99-20. And Putin early on also tries to cozy up to the West with the opportunity created by 9/11. But the Bush-Cheney regime, Bush II Cheney regime, it was pretty hostile towards Russia, antagonistic towards Russia. And it's in this period of the 2000s where NATO has expanded once, and now it expands again. Now it's right on the Russian border. The United States is pulling out of arms control agreements, that the United States is giving all sorts of signals that they intend to be the dominant great power right up to your border. And it's in 2008 that Putin finally says stop to this. Russian military modernization begins then, but it's really not until Maidan where the Putin regime begins to politicize what would have been their grievances about borders and ethnic minorities regarding Ukraine, that come to culmination and are very much in the forefront of Putin's propaganda about the war in Ukraine. So to wrap up, is the war should it be seen as an ethnic conflict? Yes, it should be seen as an ethnic conflict, but it's more than an ethnic conflict. It's a proxy war between post-communist Russia and post-communist United States, and that's a whole new area of inquiry. So it's that as well. And is Putin? If you took Putin out of the picture, I strongly believe no war. Even though Russia doesn't like what's happening, no war. The United States effectively dared Putin to do something about it when he kept complaining, don't you dare bring NATO into Ukraine. And the US was effectively doing it de facto incrementally. And they dared him to do something about it on the assumption that the cost would be so staggering, he wouldn't do it. And I didn't think he would do it. I think some of his closest advisors and ministers didn't think he would do it, but he did it. And that's where we are. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for indulging me for all that time to.
You're not done yet, Jerry. We got lots of questions
No,
for you.
you guys get to talk now and tell me why I'm wrong. This is why I can never get on NPR.
Dick, would you give us a couple thoughts?
You're on mute, Dick.
Mute. Yeah, just check me, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Taking off from Jerry's point here and a little context, I worked quite extensively in Ukraine in the 1997 period and in 2001 and 2002. So my direct experience is working in Kiev and environs and across the country and with Ukrainians from all parts of the country in that period. I continue to have friends there. I've been in communication with them before the war started and during the war. So I can't say I'm really current, but I have some currency in of information. Here's my take in the show. Particularly since the election in 2004 of Yushchenko, and really much more important since the Maidan Revolution in 2014, which resulted in driving out Yanukovych and the insertion of a whole new set of actors in Ukrainian governance and Putin's takeover of the two statelets in the east and Crimea. There's been a profound turn of Ukraine to the west, a profound sense that the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people, both Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking, are in a conflict with Russia, and a market and increasingly strong preference, widely held, to be part of the West. If I were to, the way I sum this up, both really and metaphorically, is that in Putin's Russia, a guy like Navalny, who dares to stand on a soapbox in the corner and politically challenge Putin, is first poisoned unsuccessfully, and then because he survived attempted murder by poison, is thrown in jail. In Ukraine, a guy like that, a former TV comic, gets elected president. In Ukraine, it's possible for a public personality to stand on a street corner, get on a soapbox, get 12 of his friends, raise some money, challenge the political establishment, run for office, and maybe win, like the current president. It's this kind of civic electoral structure and the freedom to participate and the freedom for an engaged population to make a democratic choice that is absolute poison for the Russian elite. And I think that's the virus that they must efface from the face of the earth. And that's the motivating factor for Russia in war, because it is death to the current regime in Russia, not simply Putin, but the entire current regime. I can't document this, but it's come to be my view. And let me just stop right there.
Thank you, Dick, and Jerry, for sweeping political history of Ukraine. That's terrific. So, questions, anyone?
Sure, I've got one. Doug Burton here. Great job, Jerry, setting the stage. I like the wry smile on your face at this question of ethnic, it being an ethnic conflict, and you swept through that very effectively, and that wasn't something that I'd been thinking about as much, or had seen quite as much. But certainly appreciating the overall history that would lead to that kind of dynamic. But one thing that seems, I think maybe some of us are thinking about, or maybe those people who might get mad at you on your thesis overall, think that there's this element lurking and on the edges of this complex Russian COPS which is Putin just needing to keep doing things to stay in power, because once he's out of power, he's dead. Kind of to Dick's point about the threats of anything more open, as has been increasingly evident in these shifting dynamics in Ukraine. So I just sort of take that as a question, like I think of Putin's doing this and leaning on all this relevant historical material and even some of these grievances as an excuse that doesn't really hold water, because he's got nukes. So you don't have to worry about the marauding hordes coming from, across the European plain through Poland, because no one's going to do that, because he's got, Russia's got nukes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with Dick's characterization of Zelensky and Putin, and I wouldn't disagree with your characterization of the Putin regime, I think, as well. I would. The regime has done nothing but become more authoritarian ever since it came to power. There's things that happened over this past year that were just, to me, that watches it every day, were really mind-boggling to me, such as the Navalny poison. One of the most respected civil society organizations, Memorial, was shut down. Showing a heavy-handedness that puzzled me. That puzzled me as to why are you doing this at this time? And it only makes sense to me now in light of the invasion in Ukraine. So it's so you talk about these foreign policy adventures. This is more than an adventure. That they can boost your rating at home, and that he needs to do that. So certainly when the Crimean grab did that, and it did that in a way that maybe surprised the regime itself, Putin himself. I've been going to Russia since like 1990, and go every couple of years, and spent a lot of time there. And Russians strike me as possibly as an ethno-national generalization, perhaps the most cynical people I have ever met, and so disconnected from and wary of being played by politicians, getting enthusiastic about some sort of collective enterprise. And I'm often there in early May when they celebrate May Day and the Victory Day in Europe. And I've seen half a dozen times the parade down the main street, Tverskaya, and all the World War II veterans. And every year it gets smaller and it gets sadder. And nobody's there. Everyone's out at their summer place, the dacha, where they're setting up for the summer. And then I was there the summer of 2014, and I was blown away by something I had never seen before in Russia. You couldn't see the parade because it was packed. It was packed like the Macy's Thanksgiving parade. And everybody was wearing medals and patriotic regalia, and Russian flags were being draped off of balconies everywhere you looked. It's like going down the street when I go visit my wife in Michigan. It's like taking a drive down her street where 2 out of every 3 houses are waving our flag. And I've never seen anything like it. So there is that boost. And I would just say this, this is different. Russians, an opinion poll came out this week by the independent pollster that showed that Putin had a 10% jump, a 10+% jump. I don't know, the pollster is considered credible. People's answers, I wouldn't necessarily, at this time, I'd be skeptical of. And, you know, Russia, it's one thing to grab Crimea. It's another thing to be at war, in a protracted war, when you're flattened in Ukraine. Russians have this crazy idea that the Ukrainians are their half brothers. And there has been, about 15,000 people arrested. They're cracking down immediately on any public displays of protest. And I just don't know that this one has the potential to have the legs if this war becomes protracted and it becomes, you know, a quagmire for Russia, and they become aware of the death counts, which I think at this point we really don't have a good sense of. But I agree with you, and I agreed with Dick too. And the thing that is so troublesome about Ukraine is this ethno-regional divide, but it's also the thing that saved them from being like Russia and Belarus. And there was, before Maidan, if you looked, I go to the conferences every year, I see the social statistics, lots of people study it. You could see the incremental, slow transition to Russian-speaking Ukrainians identifying themselves as Ukrainians, especially when you go to the younger generation. The people that are born right at the end of communism or post-communism, they might be in a Russian-speaking household, but they're Ukrainian. It's not, for them, there's no tug there. And so that is something that was in slow transition. And then these political and violent events will only serve to really consolidate that. So what was a divided nation, and what was, you couldn't call Ukraine a democracy before 2014. You might have got away with standing on a street corner, but I mean, regimes just were being overthrown left and right, and nobody is paying attention to how the rules were. If a decision was made against you, the Ukrainian parliament broke down into a scene that looked like the closing saloon brawl from the end of Blazing Saddles. Ukraine was slowly moving in the right direction after the Orange Revolution, I would say. And but these events will get them to the West faster and get a consolidated Ukrainian national identity faster as well. And there'll be, I don't know how it will be resolved. You know, maybe there'll be a kind of an ethnic cleansing. If you don't like this Ukraine, you can go and move eastward to where we've decided Russia is. Then that border is yet to be determined. Russia's trying very hard to create a land corridor between Donbass and Crimea. It seems like right now that's their main military objective. And keeping the rest of the country on its toes with its you know, its bombs. It's interesting to me that you know, this is Russia's modernized military, 10 years into the making, with the 21st century, with the satellites and the smart bombs, and Russia still fights the way Napoleon taught them. It's all artillery and attrition. We're just gonna bomb the crap out of you and just keep sending guys. It's just like, these guys are just studying. That's how they beat the Nazis. That's how Napoleon came across Europe, and that's how they pushed him back. These guys are still studying that. And while it drags on, Ukraine just gets more and more flattened.
I have a question. Actually, it's not even a question. It's more, the words that you're using, Jerry, have provoked me to think. Your words like our brothers and freedom of movement, and those seem to be, if we could create a world that was a different world where people could have freedom of movement across wherever they needed to go to be with their ethnic brothers, what would that look like? I mean, it's just, I know it's way out there, but it seems to me that that's, as you've unpacked all of these issues, underneath all of that, what drives people to want to be together and be with their brothers who are their ethnic group and our tribes? I mean, these are all things that even in this country, people would like to do that, right? They'd like to be with people who are like them. But language plays a part in this, and I think it's important. So what's your take on that?
Well, people have lived in places for generations and maybe don't want to move necessarily. When communism collapsed, there was a lot of voluntary movement. Not all of it was welcomed. Ethnic Germans who were living in the Volga region of Russia started showing up in Germany, and according to German citizenship laws, were able to gain citizenship because they could prove they had this ethnic tie to the homeland. But I think that's a move that probably is motivated more out of lifestyle than out of going back to join my cultural brothers. What came out of maybe the Yugoslav wars was some very brutal ethnic cleansings. But when the peace was finally imposed, brokered or orchestrated, I think what they've come up with as this is the best solution for this scenario that I think both the academics and the policymakers have, and it's called liberal ethnic cleansing. It's a gentle, maybe government push to move away from what was your home, and maybe for multiple generations, and to go over there. Unfortunately, we really don't have, we don't seem to have an alternative to that. So that's been terribly effective. So I'm not sure if you polled the people who are an ethnic minority. So maybe you know better, like Hungarian ethnic minorities, like maybe they live around Timisoara or a place like that. If they had the choice to go to Hungary, would they go en masse? I don't know. Or would they stay where they grew up and would like some autonomy? That, you know what, the Minsk Accords were supposed to grant, it was always very generally defined, but autonomy to the Russian-speaking regions. But the PostMaidan government never had the political freedom to be able to implement them, even in a modest way. When Zelensky first came to power, he won the election because he was going to end the conflict. That's what he said he was going to do. And he put the Minsk proposals on the table and started talking about what type of autonomy deal will you take, where, you know, without something extreme, you know, like Quebec type of autonomy, you
Yeah.
know, I don't know, somebody else. And as soon as that was announced as something that was up for discussion, the Maidan was full again with protesters threatening to impeach or to overthrow Zelensky. And it was quickly withdrawn. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I saw a hand. I think it's Dave or Doug.
Oh, I just had a very brief follow-up on that one. Speaking of polls, I thought I'd seen something a couple of weeks back. I think it was just after the war started, about the eastern part of the country in 14 would have fairly readily agreed to essentially become part of Russia. But now it's the polls swung like 80-20 to 20-80.
I've seen those too. I think I think the intervening years, Russia hasn't shown off why we're an attractive place to be.
Can I just jump in and ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if we had to raise our hands or whatever, but anyway, so just in terms of the history that you mentioned, you talked about Bush II having kind of an anti-Russian policy, but I remember that it was Clinton and Madeleine Albright who had the idea of expanding NATO.
Well, yeah,
eastward.
to begin with, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, when Gorbachev was had glasnost and all those things, he said, you know, we will not be your enemy. But it seems like the United States continued to treat Russia as an enemy even after they, at least verbally, said they didn't want to be an enemy. And so somehow or other, I have to imagine that affected Russian attitude and maybe even Putin's attitude, you know, because as you mentioned yourself, that he was more open to other ways of thinking about Russia, at least initially. And I don't know whether that was what he really thought, or that's what he thought he had to do to consolidate power. But it just seems to me that if we hadn't treated Russia as an enemy right from the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, that maybe they would have developed in a different way, and we wouldn't be in this situation now.
All right. Well, you are clearly a Putin propagandist. Well, it's a very passionate and controversial issue, but I'm sympathetic to the line, that particular line, and it was and you're right, it was Clinton, it wasn't Bush who first pushed NATO forward. And NATO's first push, which came in '97, but was promised by Clinton on the campaign trail in '96, coming on the heels of that '94 spanking in the midterm elections, in which he went to places like Western Pennsylvania and Chicago, where there's East European communities, and promised that he would work to get them into NATO. That's so, you know, it's more complicated than simply Clinton thinking about his re-election. But I feel like that might have been the trigger, and what was clearly something that he knew was going to provoke Russia. So, and then it's you know, later in the, I was in Russia in '98 and '99 when the wars in when NATO was bombing Serbia, and that intervention it shocked people. It made people were very, very pro-American. You know, that's a generalization. And the type of people that I meet are people that are likely to be more pro-Western because of the education and language and the professional things, you know. So, but very pro-American. And NATO wasn't really the one that seemed to irritate them. It was the bombing of NATO, NATO's bombing of Serbia. Like, what gives you the right? And it was, the finger was put on the US. And then you go into the early 2000s, and So when the Bush Cheney and Rumsfeld, that administration brings to power like that neocon agenda for consolidating the United States as a unilateral superpower, a uni superpower in the world. And its agenda was more extensive than just Russia, but it was very antagonistic to Russia in the way in which it openly pulled out of various arms control agreements, wanted to put the missile shield into place in Eastern Europe, and then also pushed forward the next wave and the bigger wave of NATO expansion. And it was and this time as well, you talk about the US in this period is the provocative actor. One of the things that Americans just don't seem to know is that the first instance of changing territorial borders was when the US/NATO intervened in the Serbian-Kosovo conflict and broke Kosovo free. And Kosovo still doesn't have UN status as an independent state, but probably is half to 2/3 of the country in the world recognize it as such, including the US. And then, the Serbs see that as their sacred home, as their actual center of their homeland, the epicenter. And what the US subsequently did was build the largest foreign military base that they've built since like the early Cold War period, Camp Bondsteel, that's now sits in Kosovo. They turned Kosovo into a forward platform of the US military. And Russians know that, not just Putin, but regular Russians know that, but very few Americans know that. But it's these types of actions that cause Russian politicians, not just Putin, but across the political spectrum, and Navalny is no friend of the United States, caused them concern about what is the US doing. And then comes also from the mid-2000s, those color revolutions, Orange Revolution, but then in Georgia and in Kyrgyzstan, and the US clearly taken sides in those revolutions, and then continued to do so in the big demonstrations against Putin in 2011 and 12, and then continued to do so in the 2014 Maidan. So they have a view that the US policy towards Russia is regime change. And if this war drags on for a long time, with the US not involving itself, but providing the military for Ukraine to keep it going while piling up death tolls and piling up and seeing more destruction, you have to wonder if the goal of the US in this isn't what Biden allegedly misspoke when he was in Poland, which was, we're going to run Putin out of power.
Okay.
But I don't, we got the question about it. I don't, it could happen, but I'm skeptical that Putin can be run out of power that easily, given the silent majority and given the coercive forces that he has.
Yeah, I would join your point about the GW Bush 43 administration. Also, the March 2003 invasion of Iraq was, one of the most, along with Vietnam, in my view, the two worst American foreign policy decisions of the 20th century, or maybe even longer.
Yeah.
I think just very briefly, the Clinton years, I think, were a little bit different because Clinton was frustrated that the new former Soviet states weren't getting into the EU or the training program for NATO fast enough. And so he was kind of proposing that NATO become a kind of home of liberal democratic states in the West. So there, your other points may be true, but I think that that was a different era, pre-Putin. But let me ask you also, Jerry, I think you and Dick answered this already, but why did Ukraine not get involved in this hard right populism that's right nearby in Hungary and even Poland, their big neighbor? Is Russia and the Crimea the answer? Because they had a common enemy, but they didn't, or did they?
There are those actors in Ukraine that might be branded ultra nationalist, and there's a couple of paramilitaries that have some autonomy these days, have since the Maidan, but they have not done well in electoral politics. It's Ukrainian nationalism. I wouldn't conflate ultra the far right with the Western vision of Ukrainian nationalism, right? Maybe there's a little overlapping at some edges or with some actors, but I would distinguish between the two. But a couple of those actors who were kind of given the Maidan created an opportunity for them. They were really more fringe actors before, I think, and so they've been around, but the Ukrainian electorate has been pretty decided in not voting them into power.
So the nationalism has been at least fairly positive in the sense that it's not this extreme othering in order to get elected and so forth.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, it's somewhere in between. That's my opinion. It's somewhere in between. I mean, Putin likes to throw around the word Nazis, but Zelensky's not a Nazi. Zelensky's a Jew. So if anything, the Zelensky election we'll see what happens, but it could be the moment that we can say Ukraine has finally consolidated a nation, a civic nationalism nation. Russian speakers that don't want to be in Russia, that want to be in Ukraine, a Jewish president, it's hard to push the Nazi argument. But there are some far right actors there, which there are in, I guess, most democracies these days.
Well, Lillian, I don't know how long we're able to run, but does anybody else have a question? Lillian, what's?
Yeah, I think we have, 9 o'clock is usually the ending point of these programs, but certainly we don't have to stay as long if there's no more questions.
I see Ed's hand, I think.
I have a question.
Great.
Some commentary seems to think that there's an economic basis for Russia's actions here. And part of it might be to seize oil and gas reserves that are in the eastern side of Ukraine. Is there is there anything to that?
No. That of all the potential motives, that's the least likely, because of they had to have anticipated the severity of the sanctions, and you what Ukraine might have pales in with what Russia has. So no, but there's all the conflicts. There's always a scholar that will turn up with an article in a book and a career on the rational economic motive for the Holocaust. We actually interviewed that guy. Remember, Dave? Valentino. It's like, that has to be low on the list.
It looks like Susan, you had your hand up. Susan?
Yeah. I I've been on the news, they talked about how many different ethnic groups are represented in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of the ethnic composition. And given all that's happening, do they tend to think of themselves now as Ukrainians more than whatever group they came from?
Yeah, so I think these events are having that effect. In the social sciences, we talk, we talk about identities, and we all have kind of what we call like soft identities and hard identities. So, we have multiple identities, right? And once a feature becomes hardened, it's hard to see it to see it kind of diminish. And so this isn't from Ukraine, but this is from Yugoslavia. I went to grad school with a kid who came from Yugoslavia, and one day I made the mistake of asking him, "So what are you anyway, Serb or Croat?" And he was indignant and he was angry because he was neither. He was Yugoslav. And you could, on your passport, on your official documents, you could choose to be Serb, Croat, Slovene, or you could be Yugoslav. You could identify with the state, this kind of supranational identity. So he had parents, they were kind of elite parents who lived in Zagreb. And I was like, okay, I won't make that mistake again. And then we graduated. Then the wars came. Then I met him at a conference, maybe in the later 90s, and we're talking and reminiscing, and I remembered, and I said, "Hey, so tell me, are you still Yugoslav?" And oh my God, what I opened up for the next hour. I had to watch him just bare his soul and cry and tell me how stupid I was to think you could be Yugoslav. I'm a Croat. I will always be a Croat. And so that's just an anecdote, but I think something like that is happening in Ukraine and has been this war will do it, but I think that's been happening in parts of Ukraine since 2014. So what were the boundaries of Ukraine? That they're a product of Stalin's designs. And when Stalin put a community together, an administrative unit together, he being a Georgian in the Russian Empire, was very sensitive to ethno-antagonisms. He always liked to put some minorities in there to keep everybody antagonistic towards one another, to prevent them from uniting against him in Moscow, I think. And so there's some Hungarians, there's some Slovaks, there's some Poles, there's Jews in Ukraine, in the south, in Odessa. There's Crimean Tatar Turkic peoples in the south too. And then the main group is the Russian speaking and the Ukrainian speaking groups. And the Russian speaking group is people who speak Russian in the home isn't more than a third. It's probably 25% to a third. You see different stats. But it used to be that people would make it extrapolate from that ethno-national leanings. And that's what was changing slowly, and now is probably changing rapidly.
Well, it's been really very, very instructive to listen to you, Jerry. We knew that when we started this program that the issues were going to be complex. You've helped us to create some kind of framework, at least, for understanding. I don't know that we don't have any answers, which probably no one does, but what do Unitarian Universalists do best? They ask questions and look for the answers. So I suppose you've really kind of moved us in that direction so that we can, well, we can understand and explore in a different fashion than we did before the program. So I think I am personally grateful for your being with us. And, you know, I hope that you know that we're extending an invitation that you could come back, because if NPR doesn't want you, we do.
I don't know if Dick wants me.
Yeah, well, and you know, we could even have just a fascinating discussion about Boston College someday.
Yeah, well,
would
we'll
be-
see. I mean, it could drag on. Looking, you know, from week to week, things change, but at the moment, it looks like this could start to become a kind of a stalemate with pockets of battle.
Yeah,
Well, anyone who's taken on the unthankful job of chairing a department and is still willing to spend his evening speaking to us is a good soul. So thank you very much, Jerry. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're the best, David. All right, well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
good
Thanks,
night,
Dave.
everybody.